It's now my pleasure to introduce our next short speaker. It's Professor Raymond Tallis, and I have to just read you a few elements of his CV as he approaches the podium. He's Professor of Geriatric Medicine at the University of Manchester, consultant physician in healthcare of the elderly at Salford. He has 200 research publications in the neurology of old age and in neurological rehabilitation, and a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences. He's also published fiction, 3 volumes of poetry, 22 books on the philosophy of mind, philosophical anthropology, literary theory, the nature of art, and cultural criticism. He was awarded a D.Litt from the University of Hull in 1997 and a Lit D from the University of Manchester 2002. He's an honorary visiting professor in the Department of English at the University of Liverpool. His most recent books include Aping Mankind, Neuromania, Darwinitis, and the Misrepresentation of Humanity, and In Defense of Wonder. His forthcoming books include The Reflections of a Metaphysical Flaneur and The Great Betrayal. I've added a comment which he didn't give me. In 2009, The Economist described him as one of the world's leading polymaths. So please would you welcome Professor Raymond Tallis.
Thank you very much indeed, Andrew. And I have to say, after that lovely introduction, my most wise career move will be to drop dead and leave you with expectations I couldn't possibly fulfill. But there you go. Thank you. Now, I'm not very good at my theology, but I may have been a 4th century bishop called Donatus. Does that ring a bell? And he did say, "Cursed be those who make our remarks before us." Because, in fact, a lot of what Andrew has said is actually said much better what I'm going to say very badly. So you may find you can take a little vacation in the heat in the next half hour in which I'm talking, because he's covered beautifully a lot of the territory that I'm going to dip into. My talk is going to be far less wide-ranging, and indeed is going to be rather narrow, not as a self-denying audience, not as a self-denying ordinance, but simply because my understanding of this topic is rather narrow, and I'm really looking forward to broadening it as a result of this meeting. So compared with the first-person perspective, it seems to me, the second-person perspective is comparatively neglected, at least by me. I add that qualification because just a glance at the titles of the abstracts that have been submitted suggests that there is a good deal of thinking and excellent scholarly work going on in this area, and it's been made very clear to me by Andrew's superb presentation. So I am looking forward to learning a lot in the next few days. But it makes it a particular honour to me to be asked to give one of the opening talks, because my own brush with the second-person perspective and its inescapable ambiguities has been confined largely to thoughts I've had on one of the most symbolically rich human gestures, namely pointing. I examined this in a book, I'm just going to press the knob here to make sure it works good, that I published a few years ago, Michelangelo's Finger. And so I'm going to tether my talk to a consideration of this superficially simple, but in fact rather complex gesture that reveals a lot about the complexities of the second-person perspective. This is, as I sort of indicated, a cunning move on my part, because it is the aspect of the topic in which my ignorance is least complete. Now, before I focus on pointing, I would like to make some very general comments about the nature of the theme of our conference. If you look at the second-person perspective through the lens of the grammar with which we are most familiar, it seems to have a lot of territory that is at once well-defined and robustly defended. But this is, of course, deceptive. Firstly, different perspectives, first, second, and third, are interdependent. There is no I without thou or you, and both I and thou require to be embedded or embodied or realized in something that is inescapably third person. When I look at you, I must look at your body, which is in some respects a thing, though I can attend to you in other ways, as, for example, listening to what you're saying, reading something you've written, thinking of you, remembering you, and so on. Secondly, all 3 perspectives, all 3 persons, are differentiated within themselves. The first person, for example, can be captured by a sense of I that has as its asymptote an immediacy of self-presence, a givenness of oneself to oneself. But it can also be captured by the word me, which in some respects is an attempt to capture oneself from without. It's the most proximate version of my external view on myself. Now, of more immediate interest to our theme, the second person is most obviously differentiated into a more intimate and a less intimate form of you, into a particular you, acknowledged in its uniqueness as thou or tu, and a less intimate form of you, which is in addition plural, to capture the fact that the you in question is any old you, one of many to be picked out, perhaps to be commanded, chastised, or even used. And finally, the third person perspective shades into an impersonal one. The grammarians, after all, clump together he, she, and it. Now, linguists and philosophers warn us we should not dwell too much on accidents of grammar, even though some of those accidents are so widespread as to seem like linguistic universals. But we shouldn't focus too much on them, except to use them as reminders that the territories of the first, second, and third person perspectives have fluffy boundaries, and that all is not straightforward inside those boundaries. The second person perspective in particular corresponds to an ill-defined and elusive territory. This is in part because we do not normally ascribe to it an autonomous or independent being. Though the slip in my title, by the way, I gave for my talk, I referred to second person being, but I really meant second person perspective. So, to use the standard distinctions, you clearly does not have an in itself existence, as it most certainly has, and he seems to have. Nor does you have a for itself existence that some philosophers would ascribe to first person being. Second person being, such as it is, seems therefore to be even more tenuous, intangible, or slippery than the egos, empirical and transcendental, that we are inclined, some would say foolishly, to invoke to underpin the first person perspective. While of course the I is inflected through and through by other I's, those others do not seem to be entirely responsible for bringing my I into being, although they will have a profound effect on every aspect of its form and content, its presence and its self-presence. My you is utterly inseparable from other yous, much more so than my I is inseparable from other I's in we. In short, we would never be deceived into thinking of you as having an independent being in the way we often think of I as being somehow independent. There is no you without another you. The song "There'll Never Be Another You" is exactly wrong. If there is one you, there is another one. You is entirely relational. It does not have a pure for itself as a relationship solely or primarily to itself. It is a relationship to another. It is therefore deeply vulnerable. And one can see why the territory of the second person perspective is a debatable land, and why, what is more, it has been relatively neglected by philosophers, and why affirmative action for you, such as is expressed in this conference, is both necessary and welcome. Now, there are many ways of exploring the complex and even contradictory nature of the second person perspective, most obviously reflecting on the fact that it has at least two poles, as I've touched on already, which we might capture by the contrast between thou or tu and you or vous, between the affectionate, intimate tu, which is respectful when used appropriately, that is eye-opening, aware of the equality and singularity of the other, reflected in the grammatical singular, and the colder vous, which is commanding, impersonal, distant, functional, instrumental, generalizing, depersonalizing, asymmetrically reciprocated, eye closing. I want to explore this through the human gesture of pointing, to whose complex meanings I will devote most of my remaining opening remarks. The absence of pointing in people with autism, that in fact has already been discussed by Andrew, and I know is going to be discussed further in this conference, underlines the link between pointing and the second person perspective, which is also poorly developed in people with autism. Now, pointing is rather more complex and requires more of us than appears at first sight. And its significance, what it tells us about the kinds of creatures we are, is profound. We should perhaps be alerted to this by the fact that it is a universal gesture. All humans point, and it is unique to humans. No animals point. And I'm very happy to discuss the evidence regarding non-pointing in animals, in pointing dogs and chimpanzees and so on, in question time. Nothing seemingly could be more straightforward than sticking your finger out and pointing to something. But you have to look a little closer. In order to point, you need to have the idea of your finger and the arm to which it is attached as a sign to someone else. Let's look at this a little more closely. There are, of course, motor requirements. You should be able to hold your upper limb in a certain position in order to make your arm and finger the first part of a line joining your position to that of the object you wish to single out. Put this another way. You raise your arm and index finger and hold it steadily so that its long axis is the first part of a link between you and the object. You, as it were, virtually touch the object in what the 19th century psychologists called an abbreviated grasp movement. This requires a very sophisticated relationship to your own body, in which you see its parts as signs that are visible to others, and an equally sophisticated relationship to the space around you, in which you can imagine it being traversed by a virtual line. More importantly, for our present concerns, you have to imagine that line being seen by another individual who has a point of view and knowledge that comes with a point of view which is different from your own. In short, you have to have a sense of others as selves with worlds in which they are located that are different from your own. You recognize that the other is a self that is not yourself, but is your equal, at least at the most basic level, in the sense of sharing many of your fundamental capacities. In addition, you will expect something of those who benefit from your pointing. You require them to be able to assume a position as if they were perching on your shoulder, or at the origin of the line, joining you to the object you are pointing out or pointing at. You have to put yourself in their shoes, and that includes understanding that they can put themselves in your shoes. It is difficult to exaggerate the importance of pointing. When you see a child pointing for the first time, it is one of the most wonderful moments, nearly up there with the first tottering steps or the first ill-formed word. Children typically start pointing at about 9 to 10 months, just a few weeks before the beginning of speech. It is an extremely important gesture, and by 12 months it accounts for the majority of non-verbal signs, 60 to 70%. Needless to say, of course, it has captured the attention of developmental psychologists, as Andrew referred to. Most importantly, but perhaps misleadingly, because it seems to have a central role in language acquisition. The experts, of course, have quarrelled over what infant pointing means. But it seems to have two dimensions. One is declarative, a wordless cry of, "Look at that, mummy," and it is a kind of sharing. But the other aspect is imperative. It is a wordless cry of, "Give me that." In both cases, there is an implicit you, an inchoate second-person perspective. It appears that both dimensions, pointing to share experience and pointing to what we want, pointing as giving and pointing as taking, emerge at the same time. What's more, the tendency to produce pointing gestures seems to develop at about the same time as the ability to understand them, confirming that the production and consumption of signs are inseparable, and they are all related to the sense of the other as you. Now, some psychologists have argued that one of the most important functions of pointing is in assisting the acquisition of language. Indeed, it has been described as the royal road to language, which itself is the medium of dialogue, the very territory of second person, being the second person perspective. So what's the argument? Well, the child points to an object and says, "Was that?" or some such. Trouble is, pointing does not always specify precisely what it is pointing at. And we seem to be caught up in a vicious circle, where the child needs to know the name of the object in order we shall know what the object he is seeking the name of. The trial and error process that we may have to work our way through involves so many errors that it's something of a trial for everyone. We've all had the experience of a child getting crosser and crosser and crosser as it points at an object and you offer all sorts of names. We do, however, have this extraordinary free gift, namely the child's sense that objects have names that you know, and his use of "gimme" to refer to the name it wants to acquire is nothing short of a miracle. Without this sense that things have names, that air expired from the mouth can refer to an object out there, and that object is an instance of a type of object, without all of this, pointing would not deliver the meaning of words or the names of objects. In short, pointing can assist language acquisition only against the background of a considerable amount of linguistic ability, or proto-linguistic ability, as of course Wittgenstein emphasized in his critique of St. Augustine in the Philosophical Investigations. What's more, exaggerating the role of pointing in language acquisition misrepresents the nature of language, reducing it, to use neurologist Hewlings-Jackson's sarcastic phrase, reducing language to a word heap, or worse, a name heap. It overlooks the fact that words serve different functions, that sentences are not just strings of words, that statements are more than sentences expressing propositions, and that whatever we say, whether it is hello or I have a dream, makes sense only, as Wittgenstein said, in the stream of life. In view of what has been said so far, it's not surprising that the absence of pointing, since it is so important to the development of communication skills, and since it is rooted in so many other capacities, is a worrying sign. It is an important symptom of autism, a condition that has attracted much interest not only for its importance to those affected by it, but also because of the light it casts on ordinary human consciousness. I'm going to be brief because I'm aware that it has already been discussed and will be discussed at some length during these next few days. But briefly, autism is a spectrum of disorders with a variety of manifestations and different degrees of severity, and it may be part of wider syndromes associated with brain dysfunction. The key features are impairments of social imagination, of communication, in particular speech, and of social interaction, and withdrawal from reality. The reality from which people with autism most strikingly withdraw is the shared reality of the communal world that includes other people with minds like themselves, with viewpoints different from their own, material needs like theirs, and emotional needs they can scarcely guess at. They may make little eye contact with others, either because they lack the appetite for reciprocated acknowledgement or because they actively dislike being looked at. The abnormalities of language are the most prominent. Even in people with mild autism, language is often entirely functional, never merely for the sake of communication or verbal togetherness, never for the sake of celebrating a shared sense of you or us in chatter, in phatic discourse, and it's often excessively concrete. Revealingly, as Andrew also referred to, they have difficulties with personal pronouns, particularly first-person pronouns. And here lies a clue. Although people with autism may seem desperately self-centered, the self upon which they appear centered is poorly developed. As Uta Frith said, their experiences are disparate, unconnected, a series of sensory impressions that don't add up to make a pattern. It is clear, therefore, that their attenuated sense of you is the obverse of their attenuated sense of I, underlining the inseparability of first-person being and the second-person perspective. What's the basis of this poorly developed sense of self? Charlotte Moore, who has written brilliantly of her two children with autism, speaks of their disjointed sense of their own bodies. She cites an autobiography of a person with autism, Donna, who reports that she sometimes thinks someone has touched her arm and realizes that it is her own hand that has done the touching. One would expect such a disjointed corporeal awareness to be reflected in a higher level disjointedness. The sense of the coherence and continuity of our own bodies is the primordial foundation for the intuition of a coherent and continuing self extended over time. The sense that I am begins with the sense that I am this, where this, to some extent, is one's own body. This, by the way, is something I discuss at pitiless length in a trilogy on human consciousness, particularly in the middle part, I Am, a philosophical inquiry into first-person being, which examines the origin and nature of the difference between the organism on the one hand and the embodied subject on the other, between the primate organism and the human person. Charlotte Moore observes that babies of 3 to 4 months are supposed to play, first with their fingers and then with their toes. They spread their hands in front of their faces and wiggle their fingers. They lie on their backs, catch their feet, and bring them up to their mouths. Jake, who was her child who didn't have autism, Jake did this at the right time. George and Sam, her 2 autistic children, didn't. It is not, I hope, too fanciful to see this discovery of one's own body both as an object and as the basis of one's subjectivity as lying at the root of the second-person perspective. I hope this doesn't seem to be a too literal-minded translation of the combination of first and third-person perspectives into the mathematical average of 2. It's interesting the research has shown that very young, neurologically normal infants will turn in the direction in which they see someone else gazing. According to the work summarized by Daniel Povinelli, by 18 months, children will follow an adult's gaze into space outside their own visual field, precisely locate the target of that gaze, and reliably follow a gaze in response to eye movements alone, without any movement of the head. It's been suggested that such behavior indicates that the child knows that the mother is looking at something, that she sees something, or that something has engaged her attention. This has been postulated as a precursor to more explicit forms of attention sharing, or joint visual attention, what we might call you and I attention, with each of us being both a you and an I taking our turn, what pointing both requires and tries to bring about. People with autism do not make or solicit eye contact. The sense of the other person's mind, accessible through their gaze, is poorly developed. And the notion of the other's gaze as a guide, as a pointer, not only to what they themselves are concentrating on, to what is of interest to them, but also to what may be of interest to another person, is correspondingly weak, precisely as one might expect in someone who has an attenuated sense of the self. The children who point normally also increasingly check whether they're being observed and whether their pointing is understood, underlines how what is sought truly is joint visual attention. I want very briefly now to examine other aspects of pointing and the second-person perspective to suggest it may not be an entirely benign perspective. Certainly it has aspects that are, shall we say, a little worrying. I want to talk briefly about the use of the index finger to assert power over others, an asymmetrical you relation. It can be very irritating, as you can see, very ugly. Just how irritating and ugly was highlighted for me by a triumphant Alistair Campbell, and I'm sorry this is a bit of a local British obsession, but he was Tony Blair's press secretary when he was interviewed by an obsequious BBC after the publication of the report of the Hutton inquiry into the suicide of the scientist David Kelly. It was the beginning of the post-mortem on the Iraq War. Feeling he was vindicated, Alistair Campbell responded to his interviewer fluently, indeed passionately, rejoicing in this vindication. By way of emphasis, he raised, he wagged, he waved, he wiggled his index finger. And as I watched him, it seemed to me that this single digit stood for all the arrogant, opinionated, moralizing, morally impervious people I've come across in my life. And because this is on film, I will say this is entirely unjust as regarding this individual. Finger wagging puts what is being said in italics. It raises the font of warnings, commands, menaces, and criticism. It permits even the softly spoken to shout that you are naughty, stupid, wicked, silly. The wagged finger asserts authority. It says, you mark my words, and mark them you will. It says, I know, you don't. It says, woe betide. And by the way, it's only under such circumstances that in modern English we betide anything. The raised finger says, I will say this only once, so listen up. And stabbing the air, even if the index finger is erect, it is a symbolic assault on the other, a mode of exasperated shouting that prods the interlocutor in order to expropriate her attention. It force feeds the speaker's version of events onto that other person who is thought to be either resistant or worse, dim-witted. Such pointing is poking at a distance, a one-fingered punching, aimed not at the body, but at the self and its esteem, and it may prefigure actual poking that reduces the person to his body, denying his self the inwardness by which he can escape from the defining, diminishing finger. Air stabbers may be close to poking you in the chest, poison tipping their gesture with your pain or discomfort at a kind of unchosen intimacy. The pointing finger can be used to nail laughter or menaces to their target. The victim feels skewered as if by an arrow or a digital gun. The efficiency of pointing reaching its inner target is indicated by the fact that the symbols in sign language for I and thou are pointing gestures, and that we indicate ourselves by pointing to our bodies. When you point to me, you do not simply indicate my body, you touch my person. Thus, the index finger may pack more punch than the curled fist. Most importantly, it transforms the recipient. This is where an instrumental you turns another into a he or an it, an enslaved third person mastered by another who retains his or her first personhood. And this is the other pole of the you, opposite to that in which it treats the other as an equal, as an irreplaceable I. Thus, it can also be used, the second person perspective, to make an instrument of another, make that person the servant of a group or of a cause that he or she may not have chosen. That's famous poster in which Lord Kitchener, spokesperson for King, Country and Empire, to which you owe everything, pointed you out and informed you that your country needs you, summoned you to give everything to the collective cause, whatever you thought about it. Calls under such circumstance are clarion, because they're underpinned by the assumptions which define the world in which you live. They're not easy to resist. Your sense of duty and your sense of what you are converge fatally in a response, which in this case will lead you to the misery of life in the trenches, with or without the additional benefit of death. On such occasions, the pointing finger, which nails what we are individually to what we are collectively, shows us that the society in which we live cannot be rejected without loss of our sense of ourselves, that there is no outside that is not also inside. Full marks then, ladies and gentlemen, to our parents who taught us that it was rude to point. One final observation. We live in a world in which we are increasingly addressed, as it were in a quasi-second person, by the material objects around us. You, as any you, is told not to walk on the grass, to be careful because of slippery surfaces, to watch out for signs of terrorist activity, or even, by a delicious use of deictic self-reference, not to stand forward of this notice. Artificial or automated pointing greatly adds to the range of addresses to you as the general addressee. The most obvious of these are signposts. Sometimes they can seem curious, even eerie. As a child, I used to be haunted by the little pictures at the end of chapters in adventure stories, which often took the form of a solitary signpost. But even now, when I pause by a signpost in a lonely place, I can sometimes feel that they have the ghost of intention hovering round them, which can translate, when one is in a hypersuggestible state, into the intention of a ghost. The continuous possibility of informing that takes place in the absence of an informer or an informed is rather reminiscent of those wind-driven prayer mills set up by lazy monks to do their work for them. Signposts are haunted not by transcendent spirits, of course, but by the collective spirit of the cultural society which they belong. A big you, collectivized sometimes to something like a they, addressing little you. We are addressed by the general other and are thus ourselves reinforced as generalized, presented in a second-person perspective, but as atoms of the public to whom all signposts speak without fear or favor. As consumers of the information afforded by such signs, we are part of a curious bodiless body of folk who are spoken to by part of a bodiless body of folk. What the poet W.H. Auden said so beautifully of public timepieces, and strangers were as brothers to his clocks, is just as true of signposts. Well, it's time for me to end. I focused on a seemingly simple gesture to draw attention to the complexity of the second-person perspective. It is a contested territory, both conceptually and existentially, with ill-defined borders, with much trafficking between its first and third-person neighbours, and great richness within. And for this reason, I'm very much looking forward to the next few days. I know I'm going to learn a lot and be forced to reflect a little harder on the debatable, shifting, complex territory that is the world opened up by the second-person perspective. Thank you.
Please to a bit tired now. Most of the remaining talks will be the single speaker and then up to half an hour or so for questions. But we do about 10 minutes or so, then we'll have a break for the reception. So if you'd like to ask a question, I'm going to just pass over the microphone here, and you're going to just wait until you get the microphone before you speak. And I'll maybe Dr. Silver will help by selecting a few questions.
May I suggest a division of labour?
Oh, yes. Okay.
The difficult questions go to Andrew, and the easy ones go to me. Actually, are the microphones working?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh.
This one.
No, you haven't turned it on. Oh,
Yes, it is.
It comes in a bit, it's a bit late.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Mother, at the back? Yeah.
Can you hear me? The microphone.
I can hear you. And the film people hear you. That's the goal there.
Yeah, I felt sort of in the opening talk, there's maybe two different things were being conflated. One is the second person perspective, and the other is the first person plural perspective.
Yes.
It seems to me that in the case of joint attention, what we're talking about is the forging of a we, of a first person plural. And this is something rather different from characteristic descriptions of the I-thou encounter. I mean, in fact, this generates philosophical debates. For example, Sartre has a critique of Heidegger on the basis that Heidegger argues that Dasein, being the world, is always already what he calls Mitsein. In other words, you could say that Heidegger's argument there in Being and Time is that there is always some form of co-attention involved in our very relation to the world. It is always Mitsein, there is always an implicit other. And for Sartre, in Being Nothingness, this omits what you might describe as the traumatic element of the encounter with the other, which I think is brought out in the second talk with the finger pointing and so forth. That Sartre wants to argue that there's a radical decentering of my initial, as it were, implicitly, apparently solipsistic relation to the world, which occurs when I realise there is another. So the encounter with the other is not a cozy thing at all, or at least it has this traumatic, disruptive, decentric dimension to it. And so I think that these are two quite different things. The forging of the first person plural and the positive and negative aspects of the I-thou relation. Sartre wants to say, by going straight to Mitsein, Heidegger has forgotten about this disruptive aspect of the realization that there is another, that the world is not simply mine.
Yes, I think that I hope there's nothing in what I said that would exclude the first person plural perspective as well, being involved.
Where you say that there's a first person plural between me and God.
Ah, right.
Rather than an I-thou. It's not an I-thou, it's a first person plural, isn't it? It's me and God together. Co-attention.
Well, that will be one of the. Well, that's an interesting issue because when Dante the poet goes to the one of the higher circles of the Paradiso, he sees he has a vision of the theologian Aquinas in heaven, and the question is, what is Aquinas doing in heaven? He's dancing. It's a very incongruous image for a Dominican to be doing this group dance, but it's interesting. You see, all the souls in Dante express their state through symbolic actions, and here I think that the I there has become a we, and hence the image is being used. As to which comes first, I would tend to argue that it's that ontologically it's the I-thou relationship that comes first, but in terms of temporal, but there may not be a temporal separation of those two things. In fact, very, very difficult to untangle them. But the difference is that second person relatedness could be perfect or imperfect. And I think that's a distinction that needs to be drawn. So musicians playing together may not be in harmony. And so the we has not been fully formed, and yet there's a second person relationship, but it's not perfect. But when the harmony comes along, then you get this sudden sort of it's almost like you're dancing along, and it's almost like a new being almost being born. So that I would say that's where the we comes in, and I think the two things do need to be separated. That was what I would argue.
In many ways, I find I was very muddled when I was, I'm sure it showed in the talk, but I kept on changing my mind about the relationship between the three persons and whether, in fact, joint attention was we, perhaps rather than I and you. And if we think, clearly when I'm pointing to Andrew aggressively, that's clearly a you. It's a Liverpool, I'm a Scouser, so it's a Liverpool you, and it's quite threatening. If I'm pointing to something which we're both looking at, that's a bit more we-like in a way. It's a plurality of converging eyes. So I think it is very debatable territory. And the other thing is that there are definitely two dimensions. There is the cooperative dimension of togetherness, and there is potentially the aggressive and hostile dimension, both of which are equally real.
Yeah, just to add a little footnote to that, I mean, some social psychologists would argue that it's a gender thing. In other words, male friendships are typically we have this common interest, be it football or fishing or whatever it might be. Whereas female friendships tend to be iced out, that they're in a sense about the relationship as such, rather than about some common interest, that men kind of discuss, relate to each other indirectly via some object of common interest.
That's an epidemiological observation that will require an awful lot of data to sustain.
We'll repeat the questions, or just summarize very briefly, yes.
I'm Andrea Hollingsworth from Berry College and the Center of Theological Inquiry in Princeton. I have a question for you, Dr. Pinsent. Thank you for your fantastic talk. I'd like to go back to your comparison between Aristotle's and Augustine's theological discourses, the move sort of from the third person to the second person in theology. Much of this second person language, as you know, was carried on by the mystics as the centuries went on. Sort of the theological discourse as prayer versus theological discourse as explanation. And so I wondered, what place do you see for mysticism in a second person focused theological program? And then sort of a footnote to that question would be, what of the common mystical sense that God is unnameable, unknowable, inimitable, absolute mystery, to use Bronner's language. What implications are there for the mysteriousness of God for the kind of theology we're envisioning?
Well, thank you for those excellent questions. So I was asked, what is the role of mysticism in this kind of vision, and where does it fit? And the short answer is that mysticism has been orphaned. So after the 13th century, gradually, writings by saints that were very personal in relation to God became sort of hived off as a separate activity, while virtue ethics more or less carried on. And there's a very good book called Virtue Ethics in the Middle Ages, an anthology of really excellent essays. But what they do in this anthology, they look at what people were studying in the University of Vienna in the 15th century, for example, and they were basically just carrying on. They were just studying Aristotle with a few bits of other things added on. But it was very much that older tradition. The mysticism had already got hived off. And certainly by the 17th century, moral theology had actually become largely rule-based. And the mystic elements, even virtue ethics, declined a lot. And this is covered in a book called Sources of Christian Ethics by Serveus Pincus. And only in the late 19th century did virtue ethics come back into theology in a big way, into moral theology. But only even since, still going back to the Aristotelian tradition, while the mysticism is still a little bit off on the side. And my hope for this is we can bring the kinds of things some of those mystics wanted to write about back into a systematic framework that also draws from experimental psychology and these other areas today.
Andrew, just to pick up on the footnote question, I thought was also very interesting. I mean, when God actually becomes unattainable, unreachable, that is, apophatic God and so on, the thou has vanished, hasn't it?
I would say so. I think the the great change in the Western tradition is where you start to get those nativity scenes you see on cards, and you see the baby in the cradle. So you actually got a face to look at, and really that changed the whole history of Western art, because so you start to get faces being very, very important. I hope, from a theological point of view. By the way, I'm the theist. Ray is the atheist, so we're like an ecumenical gathering here. But from a theistic point of view, I think this is very absolutely essential, and I wouldn't want a God that's unknowable. Otherwise, I might as well pack up and go home.
Or faceless.
Or faceless.
I mean, I'm thinking of Roger as the face of God, and it seems to me that God has a face.
Yes.
Very
yes,
importantly,
yes,
and I think
yes,
you're worried that God is effaced in a lot of traditions.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I agree with all that you have said, and I don't know if this is good or bad, because the discussion perhaps is better than the agreement. But only that I can say is that suggestion. I think that it's possible to say something near perhaps, that you are referring with your second personal perspective with another concept. And this concept comes to philosophical anthropology with a metaphysical foundation, and the concept will be the coexistence. A person, to be a person, is to coexist. A person, one person cannot be alone. Any person cannot be alone. To be a person implies to coexist with other persons. Well, I don't know if it's near what are you saying.
Yes. So the question was, is it true to say that being a person is to coexist with other persons? I think there may be circumstances where a person is cut off from other persons in various ways, but the perfection of what it is to be a person is expressed relationally, and we often develop towards that flourishing by means of relations. So very much so, yes.
And we tied across the periods of solitude by having our imagination populated by people we know, making ourselves intelligible to ourselves through a language that belongs to all, and so on. I mean, the ultimate sort of Robinsonian Crusoe experience, presumably, you cease to be a person when you cease to imagine yourself in conversation with others. Yeah.
Just to add a little coat to that, there was actually, I think, a recent Hollywood film about a man on a desert island, and he has to actually make a face to talk to stop himself going dying of loneliness, really.
We have 3 further questions. Sorry, Andrew has a stone.
So this is a question to both of you. You were asked very specifically how this can be related to the concept of Ubuntu in Africa, which is a malleable term, and no doubt one that has a multiplicity of meanings, but has been popularized particularly by Desmond Tutu to say that I can only be myself if you are you, and I am in relationship to you.
I'm not an expert in this area, but what I have found is that all kinds of people have converged towards this theme, or things associated with this theme, from many different directions. It wouldn't be surprising. So it's not a surprise to me to discover that there is that cultural idea.
I mean, one of the problems is at any given time we're related to dozens and dozens and dozens of people and have different sorts of relations. I mean, one has a completely different relationship to one's spouse as one does to all the people one meets, and in many ways it is appropriate that one instrumentalizes people. For example, the chap who's driving the bus, I just use him as an instrument to get from A to B. So that principle of openness and fullness of realization of the other can only be, as it were, episodically realized, can't it? Now, I think that's part of a genuine problem. If there's only one other person in the world, it'd be easy.
So I appreciated these opening talks very much, and I enjoyed their richness very much. It seems to me that they push us to rethink all kinds of things in ethics. And I just want to raise one area that I think didn't come up
So in case the microphone didn't pick that up, the question Professor Stump asked was whether the implications of this kind of field can and should be extended to other to non-human animals, all kinds of beings in which we might have a certain kind of I-thou relationship, and I would tend to agree. I think one of the things I find very disturbing today in the use of is the use of machine metaphors. So people refer to living things, or some famous popularizers of a certain kind of science refer to living things as gene machines. Back in the 1970s, we were being talked about as meat machines by early pioneers of artificial intelligence. The trouble is metaphors have power that goes beyond perhaps their original formulation. I think the instrumentalization of living things detracts from the nobility of our own civilization. I think that's, and yes, I think there are ethical implications.
Ethical implications are difficult to follow up. I mean, I have never done animal research myself, but the fact that I was any good as a doctor depended very much, or that my nostrums worked at all, depended very much on research on animals that enabled us to understand indirectly the human body, and to test out medication and so on. So I am completely behind animal research, and it would be very difficult to, as it were, feel comfortable about animal research if one thought that animals had the status of persons to which one appropriately had an I-thou relationship. The best place...
I would just say that the inference might go the other way around. Because if you have a sense of animals as a person, that might give you a different attitude towards the animal research.
Well,
the fact that good comes out of the research is, of course, not a sufficient justification.
Yeah. But
and I noticed that as time goes on, as we get more and more understanding of the personal characteristics of animals, we do alter our medical research practices. So I noticed that in the US, for example, most chimpanzees are being retired from research. They will not be used for research.
I mean, there's all sorts of reasons for that, but part two of what I was going to say was essentially, if it was just yuck that made me not want to believe that animals had I-thou relationships, I wouldn't respect myself for it. But in fact, if you look at the best kind of least anthropomorphic research, even on our nearest animal kin, which are chimpanzees, you find that they have a totally different world picture, and they have a transient theory of mind, but not a sustained theory of mind. They have episodic, as it were, little arias of tinges of selfhood, but not a sustained sense of self. Their relationship to each other is quite different from ours. And if you look at them, their actual metaphysical world picture is different from ours. They appear to be Barkelians in terms of their relationship to objects. So for all these sorts of reasons, even chimpanzees, and I'm not at all happy about research on chimpanzees, I hasten to add, even chimpanzees don't seem to make the cut as regards personhood and something that sustains I-thou relationships to other chimpanzees or to ourselves.
I appreciate that other animals aren't humans, and so they won't be capable of rational interaction or rational reflection or rational self-organization. But what I was saying at the beginning was that a weekend definition with its focus on rationality may be, you might say, a parochial way of thinking about persons, as these remarks indicate. If the nature of personhood is capacity for I-thou relations, then there may be many kinds of I-thou relations other than the rational ones.
Yes.
Yes, I wasn't for a moment thinking of rationality as the criteria that would separate ourselves from chimpanzees. I think rationality is just a surface manifestation of some much more profound difference. And I speak as an atheist humanist, not as a person who has any religious beliefs. Yeah.
I think one of the interesting things about this research is that distinction is being brought out more between the rationality part and the I-thou part. In fact, I recently wrote a paper against Richard Swinburne on this subject, who'd argue that because we might be able to derive from the universe that there's a rational God, that God is therefore a person. I would actually disagree with that based on natural theology alone, because from natural theology alone we don't get the I-thou relationship.
We're going to have one final question. I'm very sorry for those who have questions still. There's plenty of time in the next 3 days, but we can't give it to John's question. Don't worry, there's plenty of time for more discussion. Please.
Thanks very much. Dr. Vincent, I'm also interested in this book and the difference between
suggested that the Weavian definition of person, which is an individual substance of a rational nature, is somehow perhaps in a retrograde step in our understanding of persons, and that we might improve on that by thinking of, by taking this passive remark of Aquinas that persons are subsistent relations. And so then we might say, okay, well, then persons somehow have relations, or is a relation its genus or something like that. But at least any specification involves a relation. The question of a relation raises two further questions. To what and by what? I'm a son to my parents, and by what? By some fact in my history or something like that, my genes, something like that. So then you would want to ask the question, a person is a relation to what and by what? So it's a relation, I think it would be to other persons, and it would also be by what? Well, by one who is a person. But that introduces the notion of person into the definition of person, and so it raises the question of circularity. So how can you introduce this relational aspect into the definition of person without encountering difficulties in circularity?
Very nice question. Okay.
And therefore Andrew's question.
Okay. So the question is, how do we avoid circularity if we're defining person in relation to persons? We don't necessarily avoid circularity, but that's not the only way to understand something. So there are two main, if you ask a question what a thing is, there are two ways of answering it. One is to specify something. So where does it fit within a ladder of being, for example? And then you can perhaps define something in terms of something else. But the other way is, what is the bedrock? And all words, sooner or later, have to come back to some kind of embodied experience. And there's a beautiful passage I didn't actually cite in full, but a wonderful passage by Dr. Ian McGilchrist, who spoke here last year on the subject of metaphor. And his passage on metaphor is saying every word has to go back to embodied experience sooner or later. That's just this is the embodied experience we need to look for if we want to help to point out to people, pointing again, what a person is and what it means to flourish as a person. So it may enter into the bedrock stuff, even if we can't write a specification isolated from the bedrock stuff. But sooner or later, all specifications have to come back down to that bedrock, some kind of embodied experience.